Hi everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on legal dilemmas. So we're going to be discussing 4 legal dilemmas in this lecture. And what we're talking about here is really about trying to find a balance. And this is a balance that you're trying to achieve in the justice system. So when you enact laws or statutes or change laws, these decisions are really about how to achieve this balance. These dilemmas are a choice between 2 opposing moralities. And both of these opposing moralities, they're both valid and they're both valued by society. And any decision that you make is going to kind of tilt these scales one way or another. And by tilting these scales toward either end of the opposing morality, you're really going to cause tension in some sort of way. So what we do then, when laws are passed, as I mentioned, we're kind of tipping this scale one way or the other towards one of these different opposing moralities. And there's a field in philosophy that studies law, and it's known as jurisprudence. And what they do is they really look at these legal dilemmas, and they can do a formal analysis of where a society is going, and that's known as a dialectical analysis. And again, this kind of measures towards which opposing morality a society is going at the time. So if you were to do one of these, you would, look at important information regarding laws and changes in statutes and trying to decide which way that the society that you're in is going. So for example, I might look at all of the Supreme Court decisions that have been made in the last 10 years and kind of decide from there which end of this opposing morality does the society feel like it's going towards. And we're not really going to do any formal dialectical analysis in this course, but in your discussion for this week, you are going to be asked to bring up some recent laws or statutes or things that you know of and discuss which opposing morality is involved and whether or not you agree with it, the proposed law or statute. So you'll kind of do somewhat of your own informal dialectical analysis in the discussion for this week. So let's move on to what are these 4 legal dilemmas. The first one that we have here is the rights of the individual versus the common good. And this is probably one of the more important legal dilemmas that we face in our society. So we know that in this country, individuals have rights, and law ensures that we get to have these rights. But we're also a pretty individualistic society, right? So we have free speech, freedom against unreasonable search and seizure, etc. But on the opposite end of this, society also has expectations of us, and the law ensures that we match these expectations. There are a lot of rights in this country that involve balancing the right of the individual versus the common good, and these can cause a lot of tension. For example, the right to bear arms. This has led to a lot of debates, and any laws that are passed on these issues really can be thought of tipping that scale one way or the other towards one of these opposing modalities. Another example would be laws regarding whether or not smoking should be allowed in public areas. So the argument for the individual right is that they should be able to smoke, but this is pitted against the common good because we know that someone's health can be negatively impacted by secondhand smoke. And as I mentioned, if you wanted to do some type of formal dialectical analysis around this legal dilemma about the rights of the individual versus the common good, you could do things like look at Supreme Court decisions for the past 10 or 15 years. You could analyze state laws that have been passed. And then you could really write a paper discussing how our country is shifting one way or the other. You might also want to examine the criminal justice system itself. So within the criminal justice system, we actually have these two opposing modalities, one of them being crime control and the other one being due process. So with crime control, society has the right to be safe, and this is focused on wanting to keep the community and our community members safe. So this is really focused on the common good. And in order to do that, as the criminal justice system might enact more punitive measures, might enact longer sentences. But on the opposite end of this, we see due process. And due process is really focused on the rights of the individual accused of a crime. And in order to address this, we might think about, are we passing laws that really give defendants more rights in our criminal justice system? So the second legal dilemma we have here is equality versus discretion. So obviously, on one side, in this country, we believe that all are equal, and that laws should ensure no special treatment, and we should all have the right to the same privileges. But on the other end, society also values discretion. So for example, if we have a crime that is done by someone who has a mental illness, we might not want to treat them in the same exact way as we would treat an individual who has committed that crime who does not have a mental illness. Another example could be same-sex marriage, and this certainly hit on the equality versus discretion debate when we were enacting these laws. So same-sex marriage can be some thought of marriage should be defined one way, so discretion, or if marriage is the law of the land, then everyone should have the right to be married, more of an equality standpoint. So that brings us to our third legal dilemma, and that is discovering the truth versus resolving conflict. So the question here really is, which of these is the ultimate goal of our legal system? Is it finding the truth, or is it resolving conflict? So think about the fact when you give somebody a plea bargain, for example, you give someone a plea bargain, you aren't going to charge them with first-degree murder, but instead you will charge them with manslaughter, which is a lesser offense. Is that really discovering the truth, or is that resolving a conflict? It seems to be that sometimes when we focus on plea bargains so largely in our criminal justice system and our legal system, we're kind of gearing more towards the resolving the conflict end of the dilemma here, rather than truly discovering the truth. And our fourth legal dilemma here is science versus the law as a source of decisions. And when you think about it, science and law are really very different in the way that decisions get made. So for science, essentially we have empirical testing that will lead us to the truth. So this involves research and data and doing studies, and then when you do that, you will eventually end up on the quote-unquote truth. But with law, it's very different. It's a very different philosophy. In law, the truth is based on the study of case law. So essentially you look at past cases and you look at the decision that was made in order to decide how to make a decision on the particular case that you have. You don't do an experiment. All you do is you look at previous cases that were similar to yours and look at the decision that was made and make a similar decision. And this trend is known as stare decisis, and this is a very important part of law. Stare decisis literally translates to let the decision stand. So this really means that we're not looking for radical change here. We're really looking at the past decision to guide the current decision. And so what this means is that our legal system can move really slowly in changing things. So for example, it took the court a long time to view and change the law regarding the use of separate but equal facilities for African Americans over the years. So this separate but equal clause came about in 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson case. But it took many years of rulings to finally truly come around on this issue. So it wasn't until 1954, almost 60 years later, with the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, that the court finally decided that separate but equal was not true and that there were negative psychological effects that were associated with this policy that were inevitable. And interestingly, it was an amicus brief that convinced the court that separate but equal wasn't true. And I wanted to touch on this because this particular case, or this particular brief, because it was submitted by psychologists, social psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark. And what they did is they conducted a doll study. And they compared doll preferences of 253 Black nursery school age children. Nursery school and elementary school age children. So I kind of just want to go through some of the results that they found and that they presented to the court. And these results convinced the court that separate but equal had negative psychological consequences and that it should no longer be law in this country. So what they did in their research, they had a black doll and a white doll, and they showed both of these dolls to these children, and they asked the children, "Give me the doll you like to play with best." And another thing they did is that they separated out these children that had been living in the North versus the South. And while this separation is interesting as a research question, it's not the main point here. But essentially, results showed that African American children overwhelmingly chose the white doll, no matter if they were in the North or the South. So they overwhelmingly chose the white doll over, at the time, what they referred to as colored doll. Next, what the researchers did is they asked these children to give me the nice doll. And again, you can see here that overall, regardless of South or North, the white doll was chosen as the nice doll. And lastly, they asked children to give me the doll that looks bad. So which one of these do you think is the bad doll? And you can see overwhelmingly the children chose that the colored doll this time was the bad doll. And interestingly, the Supreme Court found these results pretty shocking. And they quoted some of this research in their decision. So it's interesting that we actually broke separate but equal with a research study that was done by 2 African American psychologists, and this study showed that Black children didn't like black dolls. And this really convinced the court that it was psychologically harmful to children to keep them segregated. And while I wholeheartedly agree with their decision, as a researcher, it's interesting to think about the fact that there might have been alternative explanations for these results that they presented. So is it really segregation that caused children to choose white dolls over black dolls, or could it possibly be something else? If you really think about it, how many African American children in that study in the 1950s would have ever seen a colored doll? So maybe this had to do more with familiarity of the dolls for the children. But regardless, I am really happy that the Supreme Court decided that separate but equal was not correct anymore, even if they maybe did use a study that could have been subject to some alternative conclusions. Anyway, we have now covered the 4 dilemmas, And in your discussion for this week, I want you to look around and think about, laws that have been passed and discuss how these laws might relate to one or more of these legal dilemmas. So, which dilemma does it fit in? And do you think that whatever the outcome of that law or statute was, if that dilemma is going in the right direction, or maybe we're going too far in another direction? So, for example, we all believe in the common good and we all believe in individual rights, but we vary in terms of which one is more important to us. Just remember to be respectful to everyone, and that remember that it is our opinion, and because both sides of morality are right here, that means that we are all right. So thank you, and I'll see you next time.